Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reiki Radio. I am your host, Yolanda, and today we are on day 16 of our journey through the major arcana. And I have to tell you, today's card is one that makes a lot of people uncomfortable with tarot. It is the Devil card. And I mentioned to you before, or maybe I talked about it in the Seeker Circle, but when I first started learning how to tune into my intuition, one of the first tools that I learned was how to read oracle cards. And the reason I went with oracle cards is because they were not scary. They had softer images, and, the tarot to me, just the imagery alone, especially with the major arcana cards, some of them, like the Devil, were off-putting. And what came to mind today, because obviously that discomfort or that fear is gone, what came to mind today is how we fear what we don't understand. There's a lot of fear around what we don't understand, a lot of judgment around what we don't understand, and it all comes back to, our perception, our awareness, and again, of course, our level of understanding. So that's been one of the greatest gifts of this journey is, there are so many things that we may be afraid of, in our life experience, choices that we're afraid of, whatever it may be, we start to dissipate that energy of fear. We start to free ourselves from functioning from our fear as we begin to unlayer and understand not only ourselves, but the world around us. Now, the interesting thing with tarot is in this journey so far, we have talked a lot about symbolism and the symbolism in all of the cards. So even with this card, the Devil, we can think of it as a symbol, but a symbol of what? So this card in of itself is connected with the energy of temptation and also bondage. So when you look at this card, you can see that there are two people chained, and they are chained to this little box. So we're going to get right in this today, but one of the first things I want to ask you and have you to consider today is what is binding you or challenging you with doing your spiritual work diligently. It reminds me of the Reiki principles. One of the principles is I will do my work diligently, or I will do my work honestly. And it's not just about our work in the world, like whatever job you have. It really is about our spiritual work. So today when we explore the Devil card, I want you to think about what is binding you or keeping you back from your spiritual way. Now, even though we may be on these paths, as you know, there may be things that come up that tempt us away or distract us, or we kind of have one foot in, one foot out. We are going through a process of learning how to live and be our spiritual selves in the material realm. A lot of people go through this process of feeling kind of like that, like a split, like their consciousness or their awareness is one thing, but they feel like they're operating in a world that doesn't align with their point of view. Well, the real freedom comes in when we recognize we don't have to lower our awareness to fit in, or we don't have to function from a place of giving into the ways of the world, or I guess that's the way to say it. But we can still observe and recognize and understand what we are seeing and experiencing. We can look and understand with compassion what other people may choose to do. We can look and understand without judgment as we start to unlayer our own. So I really didn't expect to say that much before getting into the card, but who knows? I never know what I'm going to say. So before we really dive into this card today, I do want to invite you to join us in the Seeker Circle. You can go to my website, which is yewchi.com. That's YEWCHI.com. And sign up for the newsletter, get access to some free tools that will further support you in your journey of transformation, awakening, whatever you call it for yourself. But you will also have a link to the Seeker Circle where we are discussing all kinds of things. So right now, let's get on with this journey with the tarot. So I told you that the Devil card is all about temptation and bondage. And, another thing that comes up with this is, what is more important really when we think about our spiritual growth or our attachment to our old ways of being? What is more important to us, our spiritual awareness or our attachments to the material realm? Now, yesterday we looked at the Temperance card and we really were considering where we may be out of balance in our lives and looking at what we may need to temper in order to create balance and harmony in our lives. And just to say, there's nothing wrong with the material realm. We're here. We came here for a reason. We came here to have this experience. But again, just like we talked about before, the beauty of being human is that we are learning how to master our human nature and really blend or harmonize or unify heaven and earth, spirit and material, spirit and matter, all of it. So it's not like we are meant to shun the material realm or not enjoy the creations that are here in the material, but not to be a slave to the material. So, okay, again, we looked at the Temperance and we looked at what was out of balance. And before we even got to Temperance, we looked at the Death card. And, sometimes with that card, we were talking about letting go and what we're ready to just, surrender to. But sometimes we have to consider, what are we doing in our lives that feels like it's killing us? Sometimes we cling to our old ways of being, or we cling to something in the material realm that literally makes us feel like we're dying inside. And then again, we get to Temperance and we have to consider where we are out of balance. But here with the Devil card, we're going even deeper. Are you bound to the fear in your mind? Are you bound to being pessimistic, to lacking faith, to lacking trust? Are you bound to your material desires? Now, the number of this card is the number 15, and if we add the 1 and the 5, we get the 6. And the number 6 card in this deck, remember, was the Lovers card. And we can see the lovers depicted here. That's who they are, although they look a little different because now they have horns and tails, and it is a symbol of them resorting to their beast-like nature or their animalistic nature. And so, we'll get to that in a moment. But what it is that they are chained to is their ignorance. So one thing to consider today is, how can you free yourself from whatever you are chained to, the illusions that you are chained to, the fears that you are chained to. Now, even after the Death card, we looked at that process of letting go, of surrendering. But the truth is, sometimes after we let go, we're tempted back, right? So let's say, for example, on your path, you have this time frame where you are so dedicated to your practice. You're meditating every day. You are aware of your ego and your higher self, and you start making choices from a higher perspective. You're doing everything that you can diligently to work on your own transformation and growth. And then for some reason, something may distract you, and you're tempted back to your old way of being. It could be, for example, social media is a good example. So, you may be someone who considers themselves very spiritual, and you are, trying to stick with all light and love and being compassionate and all of these beautiful things. And then you see something in the news or you see something on social media, and then the next thing you know, you're like, these people are effing idiots and they're so stupid and they're this, they're that. You come all the way out of your compassion. You fall into your judgment and you fall into your anger and you're upset. But more than the emotion, you start speaking from that place. You start reacting from that place. So even though you may have gone through some cycle of letting your old ways of being go, there are still things here that may tempt you back into your old ways of being. And even beyond being tempted back, maybe you've gone through a death cycle, but you haven't completely let go. So really think about that. And, with all of this work, it's about being honest with ourselves. It's not about judging ourselves. Don't beat yourself up if you, revert back or whatever. We are all learning and growing through this experience. And sometimes we fall, but we get back up. It's about being observers of ourselves, understanding ourselves, not shying away from ourselves, so that we can understand and we can use the tools and understanding and new awareness that we have to create lasting shifts. But it doesn't happen overnight. We're working on it, right? So let's look at the card. One of the first things that stands out is on the top of his head is an inverted or upside down pentacle or pentagram. Now, when we saw this pentacle in the magician card, I told you that the 4 points at the bottom were all representative of the 4 elements, and the top point was representative of spirit. So it really is a symbol of our self-mastery, our ability to master our human nature, our mind, our emotions, our will, our creation. Well, if it's upside down, this is a symbol of our connection to spirit being off or being at the bottom, not being at the top. That we may be being governed by or controlled by our emotions. We are controlled by our mind. We are controlled by, our reactions. So it speaks to not being in our authority or not being in our awareness or in our self-mastery. So another thing here, we have the energy of this card. We've been talking about the elements and the associated planets. The associated element with this card is Earth. And, we are talking about the external or the material here. And the associated planet is Saturn. And the planet Saturn is all about our lessons and even our limitations. But even more than that, it's about discipline. Because it does take discipline for us to do this work and sustain or maintain being in our self-mastery. So when you put the two together, it's the astrological sign Capricorn, and Capricorn is represented by the goat. And in this picture, of course, he has goat horns. But we really have choice in this. We have choice in what we give our attention to, what we feed our energy to, and if we are in our authority or not. We have choice. Now, the devil card is really about deception. You know how the mind will deceive you sometimes, where you feel like you have no power, you have no ability to master your mind. Oh, I can't help my thoughts. This card speaks about the deception of, you don't have mastery of your emotion. Oh, I couldn't help it. It was because of what I felt, or they made me do it. All of these stories that we tell ourselves that eliminate the truth of our choice. So again, on this path, we become very aware. We do. We have experiences that come up that make it so obvious that we have choice. And like I talked about before, we become very aware of our ego and our higher self. So it's like we come into this space of responsibility where we can't deny the choices that we're making. We know it comes back to us. And that can be really uncomfortable if we have had previous patterns of deflecting or, denying. On this path, we are really in front of the mirror, that Justice card, right? So, but again, the truth is sometimes we are tempted back to our old ways of being. We could be going really well in our practice. Everything feels great. You feel light, you feel love. And then something happens again where you may go back to an old belief or make a choice that you may have worked through. But here comes a new experience or opportunity and you revert back to your old way. Or maybe you're just not putting in the effort to support your transformation. Maybe you're not 100% fully committed to your practice. If that's the case, this card today is asking you, what is distracting you? Or what outside influence are you allowing to use as an excuse to veer you away from freeing yourself from this bondage of the mind? What are you afraid of losing? Now, that's a good question, because a lot of times in this, we will go back to or have a hard time letting go of things because we're afraid of losing something. One of the main things that I hear a lot of times when people start these practices, they want to share it with other people, and they're afraid of making the transition into doing this work as their work because they're afraid of what they will lose monetarily or what they will lose materially. Now, of course, that's a valid concern. I mean, obviously, we have to take care of ourselves. And again, that's why there's nothing wrong with understanding the benefits of, some material things, such as like money. We can use it to support us, to shelter us, to feed us, and all of these things. But when we are making choices just solely based on fear, there is something that we have to look at. When we're afraid of losing something, there's some work there that we have to look at. And, even with that particular example, I mean, you see people out in the world all the time who do this work as their work, and they're very successful at it. And I'm sure if you asked any of them, they may have been really afraid to make that transition. Some people are afraid of losing friends or afraid of losing family because of their choice or beliefs, which we talked about the other day. So, again, what are you afraid of losing? Is there anything that is distracting you from overcoming, like these inner demons or external influences? It reminds me of teenagers or young younger people, there's always these stories we tell young people to be aware of peer pressure. Don't fall victim to peer pressure. If you know something's right or wrong, you trust yourself. Don't let other people force you into or convince you into doing something you know that's wrong. Now, where do you do that to yourself? Where do you convince yourself of doing something that really isn't of support of you? And where do you fall for it? Do you justify your behaviors or your choices on the actions of other people? Do you try to justify what you do or don't do based on old hurt and old patterns? Are you justifying your choices on ego? And again, are you being controlled by fear? Now, just as a reminder again, this is not about judging yourself. This is not about beating yourself up. It's about understanding you, understanding what you are functioning from, understanding where you are restricting or limiting yourself. Now, sometimes we give into like the easy path. I mean, this work, it's not easy. I mean, even what we're talking about, looking at ourselves can be very uncomfortable. It's not easy. And sometimes we just give in to the fact that we're sick of the effort. And if we go back to the Lover's card, who, the two that are depicted here, they had choice. They were, looking at their own ethics, weighing the good and bad, the right and wrong. They were looking at the analytical mind and the intuitive mind. But in this card, we can see that they have been tempted by the pleasures of the material over their spiritual. And now here they are in bondage. So as it applies to ourselves, just consider where you feel stuck, or what is your story? What is it that you may lack trust or faith in this process, in your transformation, in your change? What are you afraid of happening if you fully commit? The trust and the faith are big ones. And I told you before that when I was going through one of my death cycles, I was literally crying and screaming and cursing the universe. And part of that, hindsight, of course, is that I was afraid. I was terrified. I didn't know what my life was becoming or what it would be. While I was following, my intuition and following what felt right and true. While I was changing, while my perspectives were shifting, while I was letting go of the old, I was terrified because I hadn't yet fully trusted, and I didn't fully move into that space of faith yet. But one thing I will tell you is, especially in the beginning, the universe smacked me quite a few times until I finally understood what it meant to have faith. Until I finally understood what it meant to trust in the process. And sometimes it's just the way. Sometimes we have to be knocked down a lot before we actually get it together. We finally go okay, I got it, I understand. Sometimes it's just what we have to go through. But in that moment of my upset, I could have reverted back, right? I could have decided, I'm not doing this work anymore. I could have just thrown in the towel and been forget this. I'm going back to my old way of being. This is too much work. This is just exhausting and I can't take it. But I didn't, and honestly, part of me, I couldn't, because there was that aspect of me that I was now very aware of that knew the truth. There was a part of me that knew exactly why I was doing this work. And the truth was, I was just mad at the process. I was pissed off that this spiritual work wasn't all rainbows and butterflies. I was really mad and annoyed that it had difficulties and challenges within it, because in that moment, I wasn't appreciating what I was learning in the process. I mean, once I stopped crying and got over it all, I literally, that time, I was like crying, hysterical, cursing and all of this, and then ended up laughing. Like immediately after, started laughing at myself, because there was the part of me that knew exactly what I was going through and why. So one other thing to ask yourself today is, are you making excuses? Are you afraid? Are you tired? And whatever it is that you may be clinging to, or the stories that you may be telling yourself, are they even making you happy? Like, why? How are you deceiving yourself, and why? A lot of times we get distracted by if and when, I'll commit to my spirituality when, or I would be really committed to doing this work if. Those are excuses. And they're ones that we have to be, again, honest with ourselves about, to really look at what we're holding and what we're telling ourselves. Oh, I would meditate if I had more time. Well, you have time. You're listening to this podcast. You could be meditating right now. Like we tell ourselves so many stories. So really be honest about how you may be deceiving yourself and why. What are you allowing to distract you, and why? Now, in this card, the entire background is black, and that is a symbol of ignorance or what's hidden. And that's exactly what binds us. That's what holds us hostage. What we hide from, what we allow ourselves to be ignorant about, what we lie to ourselves about, what we choose to ignore. And then if you look at the little cube that the devil is sitting on, if you remember, there were some other cards. Actually, let me look. I know the High Priestess, and I believe the, what is his name? The Emperor. So the High Priestess, even the Empress. The Emperor is kind of, yeah. They're all sitting on, and the Chariot also has a very square, a cube. So the High Priestess is sitting on a cube. The Chariot, he is inside of a cube. All of these different representations of a cube. Full knowledge. The physical and the spiritual. Well, here the devil is sitting on a half of a cube. It's like the physical without the spiritual. And the man and the woman that are chained to this, remember from the Lover's card, the man represents the conscious mind, and the woman is the unconscious. And here they are chained, but separate. So when we are not in union with ourselves, remember we talked about with the Lover's card coming into a spiritual union with ourselves, unifying the material and the spiritual, unifying the conscious mind and the intuitive mind or the subconscious mind. Here they are entirely separated. They are completely apart, and it has turned them into these beasts. Again, reflective of our animalistic nature. When we are functioning from a space of just like mental blinders in on the material, bound by the material without our spiritual awareness. And if you look at them, the chains on their neck, like what is binding them, those chains are really loose. And that's a symbol of the choice that we have. They believe that they have no choice. That's why they're standing there as if like there's no way out. They could easily take those chains over their head, unbind themselves. It's an illusion of the mind. I mean, even think about it. Have you ever done something that went against your judgment, your better judgment? Or have you ever done something because you felt like you had no other choice and then you regretted it? When we free ourselves from our chains, it's really, again, it's just an illusion of the mind. It's the stories we tell ourselves. It's what we choose to cling to, what we choose to let ourselves be bound by. This bondage is a symbol of being tied to our fear. Or even sometimes like what we're being fed. If you look around this world that we're in, we're constantly being fed. And remember I told you the other day, our minds are malleable. And if you are not the one mastering your mind or controlling the mind or directing your mind, you better believe someone else is. Now, an easy example of this is, commercials. We're constantly fed information of what will make us happy. We need this thing. We need that thing. All of these things, all of these outside things that are supposed to make us happy. These things that cause a lot of people to fall into the energy of envy, of jealousy, of, working themselves to death just to obtain all of these things that in the end, a lot of times they say they still aren't happy. They still feel unsatisfied because they haven't done the inner work. They haven't allowed themselves to become the masters of their own mind, choosing what they actually need for themselves. They haven't become the masters of their emotions. They aren't looking at themselves or trusting themselves. And by them, I mean we. It's all of us. We are constantly allowing everything outside of us to inform us about what we need, what to be afraid of, what to accept, what to believe. But what happens when you truly start to connect with yourself? When you start to blend the intuitive with the analytical, when you start to allow yourself to see from a higher perspective, when you start to marry your spiritual and your physical experience. What happens when you start this process of unifying yourself? It's all choice. Now, again, after this conversation, you can go right back to the temperance card where we looked at yesterday and be really honest with yourself about where you're out of balance, where you may need to temper some things to create harmony within your field, tempering the mind, tempering the emotion. And then you can go back to the death card when you truly are ready to let it go, when you're truly ready to allow a deep transformation. Something that's interesting about these cards, and as we've been doing this journey, I even had the thought, I wonder what it would be like to, once we go through this journey of the major arcana, 0 through 21, then going through it again, but backwards. Because in this journey going from the Fool forward, we have been guided to do a lot of introspection, a lot of observation. But once we get through it, and then if we go back through it, but backwards, and apply the tools from a new lens, from a new layer of understanding, I'm sure it'd be really interesting to see what comes up that direction as well. Now, I'm not going to do that on the podcast, but it's just a little recommendation if you want to play with that yourself, and I would love to hear what comes up for you if you do. So one last thing I will say is that this card, in a lot of ways, is like a really deep dive into the shadow. It's about being really real with ourselves, about what it is we are being tempted by, what we are allowing ourselves to be bound by in the mind. And, I remember, too, there was a part of this journey one time I was joking with a friend, and I said, I understand now why people say ignorance is bliss. Because once you have this awareness of yourself, again, there comes the responsibility and the truth that you have choice in all of it. And while that could sound really great, it is challenging at times. Because again, we have to work on our trust, our faith, and be diligent in our practice. We are the only ones who can do the work. You are the only one who can do the work. So, as always, join us in the Seeker Circle, share your insights. One last thing that is jumping out at the card that I didn't mention is if you notice the female, her tail looks like a bunch of grapes. And that's just a symbol of the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden and her being tempted to eat the fruit and how that temptation led to them being casted out of the Garden of Eden. So again, today with this card, we can meditate on, like what we may be tempted by, distracted by, what's causing us to step out of our self-mastery or our self-healing, our transformation, doing this work. What's keeping you in fear? What aspect of the mind? Again, the stories you tell yourself. So that is all for today, and we are almost done, just by the way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We only have 6 cards left. So I hope that you are enjoying this journey. If this is your first episode you're tuning into, you may want to go back and start at the Fool card. And because there really is a process, it's kind of like an unlayering to this in the what it is that we are considering. So I will talk to you all tomorrow. Have a beautiful day, and remember to always journey in love.